Introduction and the nature of human sociability. Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Joseph Forgas and I'm going to do the lectures in social psychology in this course. I really hope you will enjoy them. Social psychology is probably the most interesting field of psychology, at least I think so, and I hope I'll be able to convey some of that excitement and interest to you during the course that we'll do together. This first lecture is about Introduction to Social Psychology as a Science, and we are also going to discuss the nature of human sociability. Throughout the lecture, on the slides, there will be a number of embedded links to reading and also videos on the internet, which you are welcome to look at. They are related to the lecture material and they expand on particular topics that we are discussing. The study of social psychology is particularly important if you want to understand everyday social life as it goes on around us. In studying social psychology, we also have to be very aware of the fact that humans evolved as a result of a long evolutionary process, and so many of our social behaviors have been shaped by experiences in previous periods. We also need to look at human history as a record of past patterns of social behavior, which can help us to understand what goes on around us today. It is inevitable that as you study social psychology, some of your pre-existing attitudes and beliefs will be challenged. It's up to you to make up your mind about the various aspects of the social world around you, and social psychology will help you in achieving this. My personal interest in social psychology goes back a very long way. I was actually interested in this discipline from the time when I was in high school. Believe it or not, but the picture you see at the bottom of this slide is me when I was about your age at 22. I had a fairly adventurous background. I was born in Hungary, if you wonder about the accent that I have. And if you want to see about some of my early adventures, click on the link on the slide and have a look at that short video. I think the study of social psychology is particularly interesting because this is the branch of psychology which most directly deals with everyday life the way we experience it. Studying social psychology can also be very useful in helping you to develop a critical and a skeptical attitude to what you observe around you in daily life. In these lectures, we are going to look at 4 topics. In the first lecture, I talked to you about the introduction to social psychology and the nature of human sociability. In lecture 2, we're going to look at social identity and groups. In lecture 3, we're going to look at impression formation and the use of prototypes and stereotypes. And in lecture 4, we're going to look at verbal communication. By listening to these lectures, I hope that you will be stimulated and you will be perhaps forced to question or wonder about some of the attitudes, some of the beliefs that you had before. Of course, you are free to make up your own mind about social affairs, but lectures such as these hopefully will help you to question and think about what you believe. In the slides, there are also going to be a number of links to videos and readings which are designed to link the lecture material to real-life everyday issues. And at the end of the lectures, there are a number of video links to interesting material relevant to social psychology for you to look at your leisure. Let's start by trying to define what is social psychology. I selected here 2 definitions from 2 popular textbooks. Baron Byrne and Salz define social psychology as the scientific field that seeks to understand the nature and causes of individual behavior in social situations. And David Myers, the author of probably the most popular social psychology textbook, you can see his picture in the right-hand corner, argued that social psychology is the scientific study of how people think about, influence, and relate to each other. Now, if you look at the common features of these two definitions, then three things stand out. Both of the definitions emphasize that social psychology is the study of individuals as the unit of analysis, not societies, but individuals. Both of the definitions emphasize that social psychology is committed to the scientific method, and they both emphasize that social psychology includes the study of mental as well as behavioral phenomena. In other words, most of the thinking, most of the mental life that we engage in is also profoundly social in nature. When you think about yourself, the way you appear to other people, your opinions about other people, these are all subject matters for social psychology. As an interesting thought experiment, imagine what the world would be like if you were the only person alive and you would have no social input and no social knowledge. Such a person would have no language, such a person would have no concept of themselves as different from others since there are no others around. Such a person would have no human relationships, no attitudes. Essentially, most of the content of your consciousness would be missing because most of the content of your consciousness comes from social contacts and living in a society. One of the major benefits of social psychology, as I argued, is that it helps you to gain new understanding about the social world you live in. Human beings are intensely curious creatures, and we have always been interested in exploring and understanding our social environment. However, we do have many false beliefs about why people behave the way they do. So one of the advantages of social psychology is that it helps you to develop a more skeptical attitude. Skepticism is not a natural feature of humans. It's something you have to learn. It comes from analytic thinking, rationality, and familiarity with the scientific method, which needs to be acquired. There is an important issue with gullibility. Human beings tend to be naturally gullible. We tend to believe what other people tell us, and we tend to believe what our group already believes. This is not a coincidence. If you think about it, throughout human social evolution, believing what other people believe and being a member of a group have been very important benefits. So we are naturally attuned to accepting information from others rather than questioning it. What we need to learn is to question beliefs, and beliefs that are not supported by evidence need to be discarded. There are some really interesting videos at the bottom of this slide illustrating how gullibility works, why people are gullible, and some comments of common forms of gullibility. Of course, understanding human nature and understanding human social behavior has been of interest for many hundreds of years. There are several disciplines which inform social psychology and which are still relevant to us today. For example, philosophy, including the works of Plato and Aristotle, have much to say about the human condition. History is very important to us because by studying history, we can try to understand human social behavior in the past. Evolutionary theory is also very relevant because human beings and the behavior of human beings has been shaped by evolutionary pressures, adaptation pressures, over many tens of thousands of years. And anthropology is another field which compares the social systems and social behaviors of different human groups, is also highly relevant to us. In these lectures, I will try to draw on information from a variety of disciplines to illuminate the nature of human sociability. If we consider the history of social psychology as an empirical experimental discipline is only about 120 years old. But of course, people have been thinking about and speculating about the social nature of human beings for a very long time. These philosophical speculations go back to the age of Plato and Aristotle, and they typically sought an answer to the question, what are human beings really like? Philosophical answers to this question were typically formulated in terms of what's called simple and sovereign theories. Theories which are simple because they postulate a single key characteristic of humans, and sovereign because they rely on that one characteristic to explain everything. There are several examples of such simple and sovereign theories. For example, hedonism assumes that human beings are essentially pleasure-seeking and pain-avoiding creatures. Altruism focuses on the aspects of human nature which relate to empathy, support for others, and bonding. Rationalism is the idea that humans are essentially characterized by their intellectual capabilities and their ability to work out and calculate their behaviors. Stoics in the ancient age argued that humans need to realize that their life is difficult and have to understand to cope with that. All of these philosophies had the purpose of helping people to understand the human condition and give answer to the question, how should we live? What is the nature of a good life? Just as social psychology benefits from the knowledge provided by other fields such as philosophy, evolutionary theory, anthropology, and the study of history, social psychology in turn is also the foundation discipline contributing to a number of other sciences: economics, politics, criminology, sociology, anthropology, legal studies all benefit from the insights and the knowledge provided by social psychologists. Social psychology deals with human social behavior, judgments, decision-making, communication, and these are important to understand if you are interested in economics, politics, or any of these other fields. A good example of the importance of social psychology is that Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist at Princeton University, got a Nobel Prize in the field of economics for his outstanding work studying human decision-making processes. So social psychology serves as input to many other fields of human endeavor. As I mentioned, the history of social psychology has about 120-year-old past to look back on, but most of the classic studies, including the ones we are going to talk about, have been carried out in the last 60 or 70 years. Social psychology is a uniquely Western product. It's a product of Western civilization, and as most of the social sciences, it arose out of the Western traditions of individualism, enlightenment, empiricism, and rationality. Of course, much wisdom about human social behavior and the human condition can be derived from Eastern philosophy, but most of those arguments and claims have not received specific empirical support. So social psychology is part of the sciences that were developed in Western civilization. You might also wonder, why is it that it is Western civilization that gave rise to social psychology? And one possible intriguing answer to that is that perhaps it is only in modern individualistic Western cultures that social life for many people has become problematic and difficult. And perhaps this is part of the reason why it has been selected as the subject of scientific study. Social psychology is the scientific study of social behavior, but of course all of us living in society already have a lot of common sense knowledge about how people behave. In a sense, we are all practicing social psychologists. We possess a lot of everyday knowledge about the social world. The problem is that a lot of common sense knowledge is non-specific, vague, and untestable. In fact, everything and the opposite of everything can be true some of the time. Common sense wisdom, as illustrated by Proverbs, tells us that any claim that is plausible can be juxtaposed to another claim which claims the opposite. Out of sight is out of mind, true. On the other hand, absence makes the heart grow fonder, also true. What we don't know, which is true, when, and why. This is why we need a scientific study of social behavior that goes beyond common sense understanding. On this slide, you will find a number of claims, statements, which do appear to be true when you first read it. They kind of agree with our common sense understanding. And yet, each and every one of them turns out to be false as a result of scientific research. It's a nice illustration of how common sense knowledge is very different and often incorrect compared to scientific understanding. Social psychological research also can often tell us facts which common sense would not have supported. This is an example of an experiment that we have carried out at this university, where we tested the prediction that good or bad mood caused by good or bad weather has an influence on people's memories. The study was done in the Randwick shopping mall, not far from here, in a news agency. And what we did is check people's memories for different objects left in the shop on days when they were in a bad mood, because the weather was bad, and on days when they were in a good mood, because the weather was good. As you can see on the figure, people in a negative mood on rainy weathers had significantly better recollection, significantly better memory of details of objects which they have seen in the shop. And as it turns out, this confirms some interesting theories about the relationship between moods and human thinking and memory. This is not something that common sense would ever lead you to believe or to assume. It's a non-obvious finding, illustrating that psychological methods can give us understanding and knowledge that is not accessible to common sense. And of course, you don't have far to go to find examples of incorrect common sense beliefs. They are everywhere. The human intuition is often mistaken in finding connections and assuming causality where there isn't any. Common sense knowledge is often wrong because it cannot distinguish between coincidence, correlation, and causality. Only scientific methods can do that. A lot of anecdotal knowledge is actually unsubstantiated. If you assume that your own aunt drank herbal tea and got better because of it, you're almost certainly mistaken, because most people get well even without drinking a herbal tea. It's a good case of a causal misattribution. And there are many examples of common sense misbeliefs in everyday life. Alternative therapies, homeopathy, anecdotal evidence for cures, a lot of the dieting information and so on, are all examples of common sense knowledge that is actually wrong, mistaken issues. Now, I emphasized already that social psychology is a science. What does it exactly mean? But the scientific method is a very complex set of requirements, methods, and routines. Essentially, it requires an attitude of skepticism on the part of the scientist, a questioning attitude. It requires due attention to the importance of replicability. If you make a claim about a cause-effect relationship, it's important that it can be reliably replicated. In order to do that, we need measurement. It's not enough to voice an opinion or an evaluation. You really have to have objective, measurable, quantitative data to back up your claims. And objectivity, this is the idea that your subjective values and opinions should be put aside when you do science. You rely on facts to draw conclusions and to establish causality. Now, all of this seems fairly intuitive and obvious until you consider that within Western social sciences there is a very interesting movement which denies, questions the validity of the scientific method. These ideas generally go under the name of postmodernism or deconstructionism or critical theory, a whole variety of social science ideas which fundamentally argue that facts are not available and that all we are dealing with is opinions, and therefore objective science is simply not possible. So let's say a few words about this postmodernism ideology. Postmodernism or critical theory or deconstructionism are traditions that grew out of a French philosophical background, the writings of Foucault and Derrida, and has become quite popular in many university social science and humanities departments. The fundamental claim of these challenges to science is that science has no privileged position in finding out about reality, and that other ways of knowing are equally valid. Instead of studying reality and seeking facts, postmodernists argue that what we should do is analyze the social structures and the power structures that are employed by different groups in society. Now, this seems to be a complete misunderstanding of the nature of science. Science is really the only way that humans ever have been able to find out about the world around us. And if you look around, you don't need any better argument except to claim that everything we know and everything we achieved is the result of the scientific way of thinking alone. Postmodernism tend to use very complex and confusing verbal jargon. If you click on the second link on this slide, that's a postmodernist journal article generator. With a single click, you can get a completely meaningless journal article produced in the postmodernist paradigm. You should also look at the other links on this slide. The emptiness of postmodernist rhetoric and language is nicely illustrated on this slide by two famous hoaxes. The first one is the so-called hoax, when a physicist submitted an intentionally nonsensical paper to a postmodernist journal where it was duly accepted. And more recently, Lindsay Pluckrose and Boghossian, three researchers, generated 20 meaningless papers and submitted it to various postmodernist journals looking at grievance studies, and they found that 7 of them were accepted, 6 were still under review, and 7 rejected when their hoax became public, and so they had to discontinue the study. I recommend that you click on the two links and listen also to the grievance studies affair. So in conclusion, science has a privileged position in human culture, and social psychology is part of the scientific enterprise. Only science really works. It can correct itself, and it can produce new, reliable and useful knowledge, as exemplified by, for example, the discovery of a COVID vaccine in less than a year. Other ways of knowledge, such as superstition, mythology, homeopathy, acupuncture, Chinese medicine, and so on, do not work because they do not provide factual evidence for their claims. You might wonder, why is it that the academic world is often the home of what seem to be half-baked ideas? If you want to get an answer to that question, click at the link on the bottom of this slide. Now next, I'd like to move on to the next big topic that we're going to cover, and that's the nature of human sociability. Humans are profoundly social creatures, and as we have seen in this lecture already, a life alone is almost unimaginable. We are profoundly social animals. Our evolutionary success and survival is largely due to our unparalleled ability to interact and coordinate with others. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that social isolation, being cast out of society, can be extremely detrimental. Abandoned children, hermits, people who become shipwrecked, all report very painful, negative, and damaging experiences. Of course, it's difficult to study the effects of isolation experimentally because it would be unethical, but Stanley Schachter did try to see how well people tolerate being isolated even for short periods of time. And he found that when people volunteer for an isolation experiment, some of them can't last more than about 10 or 20 minutes and ask to be allowed out because they find the isolation so painful and intolerable. So sociability is incredibly important, and isolation has very negative consequences. If you are isolated from birth, it tends to be irreversible. If you're isolated temporarily, the symptoms tend to be similar to psychotic states, hallucinations, and so on. Empirical studies also show that humans are intensely social creatures. This is a survey simply looking at how much time adolescents and adults spend in the company of others as against alone. And as you find at the bottom of the graph, adolescents spend about 74% of their waking hours in the company of others, and adults about 70.9%. In other words, humans are so intensely social that they spend about 3/4 of their time not alone, but with other people. So you might ask the question, how do we explain this intense need for sociability? There are a number of theories. I will mention only 4 of them. Evolutionary theories argue that we are sociable because we have been naturally selected to be sociable. All our forebears, many generations backwards, had to be highly sociable to survive. In other words, sociability is an adaptive resource that makes it more likely that sociable people survive compared to antisocial people. So it's not surprising that sociability becomes a general trait in the human population. Reinforcement is another theory that proposes that humans are sociable because we get positive reinforcement from other humans. From the moment of your birth, your mother, your family, and others will give you positive reinforcement, and so you become sociable. The problem with this theory is that people are often sociable in ways that has never been reinforced. We seek the company of others, we explore, we want to be in social situations, even if we never experience that situation, and even if we never have been reinforced in that situation. Social comparison is another theory for sociability, and it basically argues that only by comparing yourself, your ideas, your behavior with other people can you have any sense of reality. Think back of the thought experiment of being alone in the world. If you were alone in the world, all of your behaviors would be equally acceptable or unacceptable. Only when there are other people around you can you figure out what works, what doesn't work, what's right, what's wrong. So social comparison is the idea that we need other people to develop a coherent, consensual worldview which is shared by others. If others don't agree with us in our thinking, we are going to be mentally ill, in effect. Agreement with others, which comes by social comparison, is the foundation of social communality. And finally, social exchange theory predicts that sociability is so common because uniquely, by interacting with other people, both individuals can produce greater benefits to themselves than the cost of the interaction. This is a kind of marketplace model of sociability. By interacting, both individuals can be deriving benefits. For example, if you have a friend David, and David is a very sociable, outgoing, popular person. You, on the other hand, are a good student, but fairly lonely. If you interact with David, you can both benefit. You can go to parties with David because he gets invited, and David gets help from you to write his essays. So both of you can provide a resource to each other, which is more valuable to the other person than the cost to yourself. Sociability, as I mentioned, is likely to have very strong evolutionary roots. One interesting line of evidence for this is the relatively explosive, very sudden development of the human brain. As you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, the growth in the size of the human brain has taken an exponential growth curve in the last 1 million years or so. And that suggests that there may be a relationship between the evolution of the human brain and the increasingly complex sociability of human beings. If you're interested in evolutionary social psychology and how human beings evolved, I strongly recommend that you look at a book by Bill von Hippel. He used to be here at the University of New South Wales and he's now at Queensland University, who wrote a best-selling book on the evolution of social behavior called The Social Leap. You can find out details by clicking at this link. Now, the idea that the brain and sociability are closely connected has received some very strong support in recent years. The idea is that you need a big brain, very complex cognitive capacities, simply to coordinate social behavior. The more sophisticated the social life of a group, the larger the brain that they need for managing this. In other words, it is the demands of managing social relationships that seems to drive the development of the human brain. Adolf, in this link, has talked very interestingly about how the brain deals with social information. Robin Dunbar, a biologist at Oxford University, proposed what is now called the social brain hypothesis. Dunbar looked at the size of the average group in different primates on the left-hand axis of this figure, and the size of the neocortex of the different primates. And what he found was a very strong linear relationship. The larger the group in which a primate lives, the larger the neocortex of that particular species. And that supports the idea that a large brain primarily serves the demands of complex sociability and social interaction. Dunbar also argued that for humans, the group size that our brain is equipped to deal with is about 150 people. That's sometimes called Dunbar's number, and you can click on that link and hear talk about that. Dunbar showed that if you look at over human history, 150 seems to be the typical size of basic human groups. Roman legions had 150 people in their basic military unit, and that's still the case today. Most hunting-gathering tribes have about 150 people in them. Feudal villages are usually about 150 people. And even in modern-day Britain, when you look at the number of social contacts that people maintain, for example, by analyzing the number of people they reach by sending Christmas cards, that turns out to be about 150. And watch this. If you look at Facebook relationships, Dunbar found that most people have about 120 to 150 active Facebook relationships. This seems to be the magic number that the human brain is capable of remembering, integrating, and interacting with. So if human social behavior has such a strong biological and evolutionary determination, an interesting question arises. How flexible is our social behavior? We tend to think that humans are somehow a class apart from the animal kingdom. We have consciousness, we have intelligence, and we tend to infer that because of that, we can change our social behavior at will. Social behavior should be very flexible and very changeable. On the other hand, as we have seen, evolutionary influences play an important role in the development of human sociability. This is a really important question, because if you want to change human behavior and you take a nurture perspective, in other words, you believe that you simply change the rules, you change the norms, and people can behave accordingly, then you assume complete behavioral flexibility. Social engineering, the idea that we can do anything we like by getting people to behave differently, is based on the assumption of complete behavioral flexibility. If, on the other hand, human behavior is partly determined by biological evolutionary factors, then we cannot change behavior at will. Then there are limits that we cannot transgress. So how do we find out the answer to this question. How flexible is our behavior? We can study changes in human social behavior over time by looking at history, and we look at changes in human social behavior across cultures by looking at anthropology. So let's look at this now. When we look at changes in human social behavior over time, a number of people, especially Steven Pinker, who wrote a fantastic book entitled The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I gave you a link here, argues that if you look at the change in Western civilization from about 1300 to the current time, what you see an amazing, dramatic, unprecedented change as far as violence, aggression, and human freedom is concerned. Western cultures have become immensely much less violent, much more tolerant, much more free, and much more rational. So there is evidence from history that some basic aspects of human nature, like violence and aggression, can change over time if the civilization makes it necessary. Please look at the video, How Social Life Changed Over Time, and have a look at Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. Now let's look at anthropology, comparing behavior across cultures. A classic example here is Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous anthropologist of the 20th century, who set out in the 1920s to do fieldwork in Samoa with the express intention to prove that Western norms of sexuality, adolescence, and social behavior are not universal and that other cultures behave very differently. She spent some months in Western Samoa. She never learned the language, and she spoke to a number of female informants and asked them about how Samoans live. And based on this information, she wrote a best-selling book called Coming of Age of Samoa, in which she basically argued that Western norms of sexuality, of adolescence, of violence, are totally arbitrary because here is another culture, Samoa, which is totally different. People have no hang-ups about sexuality, they don't care about virginity, they don't care about premarital sex, they're much less violent, adolescents naturally grow up to be adults without any stresses, and so on. This book, The Coming of Age of Samoa, became the best-selling book in anthropology ever, and it had a huge cultural effect. As a result of that book, Western social scientists believed that anything can be changed. We can change our culture whichever way we like. There is nothing preordained about the cultural habits in our civilization. If Western norms are arbitrary, then we can change our habits on sexuality. This led eventually to sexual liberation. The relationship between the two sexes or genders can be revised. That led to feminism. All gender roles are negotiable. That ultimately led to current ideas that gender is a social construct and has nothing to do with biology. Margaret Mead herself lived according to this value system. She had female sexual partners as well as a multiplicity of male sexual partners, believing that the Western norms simply don't apply and can be easily transgressed. So Margaret Mead described Samoan society as a kind of ideal South Pacific paradise where there are no sexual taboos, there is little delinquency, violence, or suicide. Unfortunately, it turns out that an Australian anthropologist, Derek Freeman, went back to Samoa later and studied Samoan society in much greater detail than Margaret Mead. He learned the language and he stayed there for much longer than Margaret Mead did. And what he found was exactly the opposite of what Margaret Mead reported. Derek Freeman reported that Samoan society is plagued by severe sexual taboos, delinquency, violence, and suicide. So, how could that be? Freeman showed that Mead was misinformed by the few women she asked for information who felt so embarrassed by her questions that they gave her the answers that she was looking for. It's interesting that Derek Freeman's book, a much more detailed and better documented report on someone's society, was actually condemned by the anthropological community because they also did not want to hear what Freeman had to say. There are some interesting implications as a result of this controversy. It turns out that some social behaviors, such as aggression and violence at a social level, can probably be decreased as civilizations become more sophisticated. On the other hand, other behaviors like mating behaviors, sexual behaviors appear to be universal across different cultures. And that suggests that there are some biological and evolutionary factors which play a role in some aspects of human behavior. It turns out that biological sex might actually matter in determining how people behave because all cultures seem to show similarities. There are interesting contemporary controversies about the biological determination. For example, some theorists claim that sexuality and gender behavior are socially determined on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, homosexuality may be determined by genetic or other biological factors. These sorts of issues are hotly debated at the moment, and what they suggest is that we need to be very careful in not confusing facts with ideology. What is the case with what we would like to be the case for various social reasons. So, looking at the anthropological evidence, and in particularly the Mead-Freeman controversy, there seem to be some indications that some classes of social behaviors, particularly social behaviors that relate to male-female behavior, mating behavior, relationship behaviors, might be influenced by evolutionary factors which are still with us today. David Buss, a social psychologist, has collected a lot of data analyzing, for example, mating ads and surveying sexual preferences, documenting the fact that even today, men typically are more promiscuous, more interested in casual sex, and more likely to be the seekers in establishing relationships. Women, on the other hand, tend to be more cautious, less interested in casual sex, and more likely to be the choosers in relationships. It is especially interesting that these differences endure despite the fact that we now live in a very different environment than our Stone Age ancestors. We now have widely available contraception, for example, so falling pregnant is not a danger having a sexual contact. We have social norms which encourage or allow far more sexual liberty than in previous periods. And yet, despite these fundamental changes, there is a lot of evidence that male-female differences in relationship behaviors, mating preferences, and sexuality continue to be very similar to the way they have been in previous periods, which indicates that we might be dealing with an evolutionarily determined behavioral pattern. So, for example, Clark and Hatfield in 1989 showed that men are far more willing and prepared to engage in casual sex than are women. In this study, men and women were faced with the question whether they would be willing to go out with each other, to go up to the other person's apartment, or go to bed with the other person. And as you can see, men were far more willing to go up to the apartment and go to bed. In fact, no women agreed to go to bed in such a casual situation. This again illustrates that the differences in sexual behavior of men and women endure despite the wide availability of contraception. Male-female differences are also very marked. If you look at the number of sexual partners expected or desired by men and women, according to the study by Buss and Schmidt, 1993, over all time periods, men expect and desire more sexual partners than do women. Men and women also demonstrate different patterns of jealousy. Men are far more concerned about sexual infidelity in their partners, and females are far more concerned about emotional infidelity. Now, how can we explain these really clear differences between the sexual behavior and mating behavior of men and women? Robert Trivers suggested a theory called parental investment theory that goes some ways towards explaining the different behavior of males and females when it comes to selecting sexual partners. According to Trivers, the higher investing sex, which in humans happens to be the female, will be the choosier, causing the opposite sex, the male, to be more competitive in pursuing it. To put it simply, men seek to propagate widely and women seek to propagate wisely because propagation, sexuality, reproduction for women is much more costly. It involves a lengthy period of gestation and a lengthy period of a dependent infant. So for women, engaging in reproductive behavior is potentially risky, and they will be much more selective and cautious, careful in selecting a mate. Men. So this is a summary of this theory, parental investment theory. For males, reproduction involves minimal investment of time, energy, and risk. As a result, males can maximize their reproductive success by seeking more sexual partners with high reproductive potential. And in terms of behavior, this means that men have more interest in uncommitted sex, greater number of sex partners over their lifetime. They look for youth and attractiveness in their partners. Women, on the other hand, have a reproductive biology which involves substantial investment and cost in time, energy, and risk. As a result, women tend to maximize their reproductive success by being selective and seeking partners who are willing to invest material resources and time in caring for them and their offspring. As a result, women are less interested in uncommitted sex, they have smaller number of sex partners over their lifetime, and they tend to look for income status and ambition in their potential partners. So, just to sum it up, in this lecture we looked at the nature of social psychology, its definition, history, principles, how it's different from common sense, and social psychology as a science. Then we moved on to discussing the nature of human sociability. We looked at the question of behavioral flexibility, historical changes in social behavior, and the role of evolutionary influences in various kinds of social behavior. In particular, at the end of the lecture, we looked at sex differences in male and female mating behaviors, a fascinating illustration of how these deeply ingrained evolutionary differences endure despite the fact that now there is widespread availability of contraception, so women no longer risk pregnancy as a result of sexual activity, and the social norms have also changed fundamentally, and yet male and female differences remain fairly stable, consistent with the idea that this is an evolutionary difference. We are going to continue in the lecture on human sociability, and I also encourage you to look at the School of Life videos on the following pages. Just click on any of the links and enjoy.